you. It's a very warm welcome. I feel very humbled to have listened to people with such expertise from around the world. And so hello from New Zealand. It's very early in the morning here, but I'm very pleased to be with you all. I want to take a slightly different tack with my presentation and talk about how we work across borders from a much more philosophical point of view, and obviously from the background that I come from, which is based in a university educating large numbers of health professionals. So I think I'd just like to begin by saying I think that there are very different types of borders that we all need to deal with. There are geographical borders that exist between nations. There's cultures and heritage and Indigenous expertise, which have their own borders. And there's also the expertise that resides between different disciplines in the healthcare provision space. So my insights about this come from this part of the world, and I'm going to talk about people's perspectives across those borders, what knowledge looks like from those different perspectives, talk a little bit about context, and then finish by talking about communication, because I think finding ways to do that is the way forward. So to begin with, just a little bit about where in the world I am, and I'm right at the very bottom of the South Pacific. New Zealand is a very small nation. It has about the same land mass as the United Kingdom, but only 5 million people, and often just doesn't even appear on maps of the world. In fact, if you go and look at templates of world maps on Google, you'll probably find that New Zealand is not there. So it's a very tiny corner of the world, but it has an Indigenous group of people. So Māori settled in Aotearoa, New Zealand, between 1,000 and 2,000 years ago, and developed their own system of medicine. However, New Zealand was colonised by the British and in 1840 signed a treaty between the British Crown and the Indigenous New Zealand Māori. That worked really well for probably the first 20 years, but then the critical mass of settlers extended way beyond the number of Indigenous people on the land. And so the colonisation extended to legislation which marginalised Māori people and also their access to healthcare. And that extended to a piece of legislation in 1907, which actually outlawed Indigenous knowledge and healing. And so while New Zealand has a very, very highly developed and broadly available public healthcare system, which is publicly funded, it does not include any of that expertise or knowledge or wisdom. And in fact, we made it illegal. And so it sits a long way behind other areas of knowledge and expertise on the world stage. Alongside that, it's worth noting that New Zealand was one of the founding members of the UN in the 1940s. So I work in a university in a faculty of health, and like any faculty of health, it has an emphasis on teaching and research. But we are also really committed to clinical practice that serves the community. So we graduate more health professional students from a bigger range of disciplines than any other faculty in the country. And we have a very deliberate position about the Treaty of Waitangi that was signed with the British Crown and what that means for Indigenous Māori, and therefore how we set about recognising a wider range of health professional knowledge and expertise than what we see in westernised empirical science. The problem is, though, that our healthcare system does primarily fund Western medical science and not anything else. So we have extensive public healthcare funding in New Zealand, but it is very limited in its view of what constitutes health and well-being. So my responsibilities in that university are for the curriculum of all of those students and the regulation of how we teach students and how they graduate to practice and be recognised by the state. We take great care in combining our clinical services into an integrated clinic, and in 2009 we took a large number of clinical services that the university offered to the community, and we combined it into an interprofessional service. And I was the first director of that clinic, which seemed as if it was going to be very simple, but actually was much more complex than that. The faculty took a position on the World Health emphasis on interprofessional healthcare. So around the same time, the WHO had published a document about interprofessional education and collaborative practice. And they were very clear that we couldn't just keep educating lots of distinctive health professionals with their own specific field of knowledge and expertise. We had to find a way for them to understand one another and interact with one another and maybe even share scopes of practice. So this clinic was designed deliberately to try and establish a way for our disciplines, even though they were largely medical, to respect Indigenous knowledge and expertise so that we could make a big difference to the healthcare outcomes of those people in society, but also reflect that international commitment to what really good practice needed to look like for the world going forward so that people could access it. And I think at a moment in our history where we have a global pandemic, understanding why people need access to healthcare and how to think about healthcare from a much broader perspective than we traditionally have has come to light. And we need to be taught these lessons, I guess. My own grandmother's 106 years old, and she remembers the influenza epidemic in 1917, and obviously she survived it and has survived a number of major events since then. And she has a really interesting perspective on how the world is a much bigger place than we think about until something goes horribly wrong within it. She also, interestingly enough, talks about how it feels as if it's never going to be the same again, but we do recover. So alongside this work about what healthcare looks like and how people can fairly and reasonably access it, we've come to understand that the wisdom that is shared, especially in the textbooks that are used to educate health professionals, doesn't make sense if you ask questions about what counts as interprofessional expertise and how you need to understand Indigenous people. So we've spent an enormous amount of time and effort in this part of the world and within this faculty, working with Oxford University Press, publishing textbooks that would make the most sense for our students. And I have to say this was very difficult to do because there is a very strongly held view in these highly esteemed academic textbook publishing houses that North American or British expertise holds reign. And I think that's partly about the English language and partly about where the largest group of people are who are going to buy their textbooks. So we've taken great care to ensure that our students have textbooks that are specific to this country and include wisdom and expertise from around the world, but also represent Māori and what it means to be a colonised and Indigenous people in terms of health and well-being. So we have a number of priorities as we educate our students in this faculty. We know that not all people benefit from services that don't relate to them. So even though we have a healthcare system which spends an enormous amount of money and talks about being accessible to everybody, we know that the health outcomes for Indigenous people in this country are way less than others. And in fact, the Māori population have a life expectancy which is approximately 10 years less than European settlers, even at this point in our history. And we are debating whether or not to give COVID-19 vaccines to people on the basis of their ethnic background rather than their age. So when we talk about the group of people who are going to be vaccinated first, and that's probably we're vaccinating already, but probably the next group of people to be vaccinated will be people who are 65 years of age and older. But for Māori, we think that needs to be people who are 55 years of age and older, because of their health outcomes and because they are entitled to equity. And so it needs to look different for them. So my interest in Ayurveda began on a visit to India with the Giles Brooker Group in 2011. And while I was there, I was intrigued to find such an approach to healthcare that respected traditional wisdom in a way that we just didn't seem to understand it in this part of the world. And there were two very brief conversations I had with people on that visit, and there was one particular day, and they were just incidental conversations. First of all, I was introduced to this concept of practice-based evidence. And coming from a Western medical background, which has such a focus on evidence-based practice, that was enormously challenging. And when I came home and co-edited a textbook on research for our undergraduate health students, I ensured that we talked about practice-based evidence within it. It was a watershed moment for us. And the other very brief conversation on that day was I asked the question about how you would communicate this wisdom to people in other nations and from other traditions. And I asked whether or not ICD, the international coding system that the WHO was evolving, would be an opportunity for that. And the conversation at that point in time was no, it was unnecessary, and there was no need to have an engagement with that. But those two brief conversations were pivotal in my thinking going forward about our practice in this faculty. So I think one of the things that we've learned to do with students is to challenge key concepts and to constantly ask them what constitutes knowledge. So we still teach, obviously, Western medicine approaches to evidence and research in this faculty. But we also ask students to think very carefully about what constitutes knowledge. And we also are very clear that evidence-based medicine and evidence-based practice cannot answer all of its questions in terms of when you're sitting in front of a patient trying to figure out what to do next. You do need the evidence that comes from randomized controlled trials, but you also need to trust your judgment and your expertise. And just yesterday, I was talking with a colleague about the number of times in my clinical career that I've walked into a patient's room and thought, what's going on here is very serious, but the machinery that this patient is attached to hasn't noticed yet. And just knowing that something is wrong and waiting for the evidence in front of you to catch up is a reality for many of us working in clinical disciplines. And last year we had, 2 years ago now, I feel as if I've lost the year 2020. 2 years ago in New Zealand, we had an academic from a university publish a paper in a journal which had simply been entirely written by a software autocorrect program. And this hit the public generic media as part of the debate about what constitutes knowledge. So while we teach students how to understand knowledge and engage in Western medical science, we are also very critical because we want them to think critically about what that means on the world stage across borders. This idea that evidence-based medicine is not the answer and in its entirety, and we have to constantly keep talking and moving forward, respectfully questioning wisdom and expertise is a key element of how we teach students now. And obviously randomised controlled trials continue to be the gold standard, and we conduct them in our clinical services and in our faculty, but we also insist that students think about them in context. We have a clear understanding that one of the borders to developing practice on the world stage is language. And we know that there are professional boundaries as people try to communicate. There's philosophical boundaries, and there's also language differences. And there's a clear differential between those that are able to publish with English as their primary language and those who have to jump through extensive hurdles to publish because English is not either the language of their study or the language of their research. We appreciate that we're in a very privileged position having English as our first language. The disadvantages in New Zealand that we do not routinely learn second languages at school. We are useless at European languages, for instances. And the other thing that we want students to understand, that the world is not pure. So knowledge is not pure, and perspectives are not pure. And so we want students to live in a space where we balance purism and pluralism. So the lessons, we understand that health is very complex, that understanding physiology, of course, is absolutely essential, and constant innovations in knowledge and science are absolutely imperative, because we know that at the point that students graduate, a lot of what we've taught them will be irrelevant. It's just that we don't know which bit is going to be irrelevant by the time they graduate. And people across the world teaching students have to deal with that. We want students to be able to think critically enough to change their mind about something. And in my clinical career, very fundamental things have changed a number of times. Nutrition knowledge has changed. How many eggs you're allowed to eat a week, whether they're good for you or bad for you, whether or not you should have them every day or be limited to 3 a week, have been subjects of public health messaging during the period of my clinical career. And the positions in which we put babies to sleep is another example. It's changed emphatically at least 3 times during my clinical career. And each time based on apparently absolutely sound science. But the reason it's changed each time is because the science has discovered that more babies have been dying because people have been putting them to sleep in the position that we've asked them to. So I think we have to be mindful that things go on around us all the time that should impact on how we think about our practice and well-being. So there are some very particular insights from running this large interdisciplinary clinic in our faculty that I just want to present to you. The first one is that every discipline is passionate about their field of expertise. One of the things I learned was that people have a strong personal and professional identity attached to their discipline. So the physiotherapists don't just understand physiotherapy, they actually live physiotherapy, and any criticism of the field of physiotherapy knowledge feels like a personal challenge to them. These disciplines will work in parallel with one another rather than working alongside one another. So they will understand what is said by the WHO in terms of interprofessional practice, but what they believe deep down inside is that their own practice and their own profession is the best one. It's the one out in front. It's the one that needs to be first. So the dental team passionately believe that the whole of human health is fundamentally about how healthy your teeth are. And there is good scientific evidence that if your teeth are in good condition, you will be able to eat, and you are less likely to have cardiac complications, and you will live a long life. But the podiatry team believe exactly the same things about feet. And so when you're running an interprofessional clinic, all of these things need to be balanced, and finding ways for them to work together rather than working in parallel is just a constant challenge all day, every day. It looks as if it's happening, but they're not really believing it. And I think the fundamental thing I do in that space is I just come back to the patient all the time. I just constantly ask the question, what is the patient seeing? What do they need? What happens to them when they walk into this space? Because if you can bring all of those disparate views of the world and professional senses of identity and expertise back to what does it mean for this patient at this moment in time, then it's a very grounding place to move forward from. So colonization is a reality for us in this place geographically. It's also a reality for us in terms of the disciplines that we are a part of, because some disciplines are more powerful than others. Some disciplines have expertise and knowledge which is ranked more highly than others. But we also have to understand that there is a colonization that happens in terms of knowledge and expertise. It's not just about ranking. It's about how your wisdom is seen in relation to the wisdom of others. So when we look across geographical boundaries, we can see these differences. And I think we have to assess healthcare and the way we prepare people to engage with it in terms of all of the expertise that's available to us. Now, as a result of colonization in this country, while we have an Indigenous group with a traditional approach to healthcare knowledge and expertise, it was outlawed many, many years ago. And that Māori expertise around well-being is completely informal. It is not funded, and it is not part of our healthcare education system. Other than we want students to respect it, we do not have a faculty anywhere in the country that teaches the Indigenous knowledge about herbs and plants, for instance. It simply does not exist. So when we're thinking internationally, one of the key agencies for understanding how to bring expertise together and think about how health professionals and expertise may make a difference collaboratively internationally, the WHO is one of those organisations. Now, there's all sorts of reasons why large international organisations are unappealing. But coming from a really small nation, I can see why it's important to be part of large international opportunities, because it's good for us to contribute and it's good for us to engage and benefit. So more than a decade ago, the WHO started publishing information about how it was thinking that we needed to include Indigenous and traditional knowledge and wisdom when we were thinking about what healthcare was available to people and how it was understood. In New Zealand, we talk about how important it is not to talk past one another when we use the same language and we think we're sharing the same concepts. Often, actually, we've attached different meanings to them. So there is enormous risk when we translate information that we're transliterating it, which is not as generous as it could be. We're interested in what the meaning is when we're trying to understand concepts. And I would suggest that shared languages have a place and can be defined within coding and ICD in particular. And I know that there's enormous concern about the power of a large international agency deciding how to define things. But I'm also really clear that it is not there to define the wisdom. It is there as a tool to communicate. So agreeing on language is a really complex task. But I'm also really clear that Indigenous and traditional medicine, when it's working in this space, should claim its expertise. And there are some terms that should not be translated into English. And for instance, they can be explained, but they shouldn't be boldly interpreted. So AYUSH has done an amazing job. When I look internationally at opportunities on a national scale to recognise and value Indigenous and traditional wisdom, I think India has done amazing work in this space, and it's very humbling. We do not have anything that compares with the work that AYUSH and these organisations and experts that sit in these privileged places in India have managed to do. So from my point of view, there are some considerable risks when we work in this space of trying to communicate across the borders that are geographical, linguistic, and also discipline specific. People are fearful of being misunderstood. They're fearful that their expertise will be devalued or marginalised or criticised, and they have good reason to fear that. When I look at the experience of Māori in New Zealand, that it absolutely happened to them. And so I completely understand that. And I'm also really sensitive to the concept of appropriation. And I think when I look at Ayurveda in some parts of the world, there are places where Ayurveda is marketed in the healthcare space, often to quite wealthy people, and often in ways that are cursory. And if Māori healthcare was being marketed or promoted in other parts of the world in that way, we would be deeply concerned that their wisdom and knowledge was being appropriated. And we feel that way very sensitively when our national icons are appropriated in other parts of the world. So we are particularly mindful of that. So being part of the WHO group that's looking at agreed terminology for Ayurveda, there's some insights that I've evolved through these meetings. First of all, we're not apologists. None of us are there to defend the wisdom that has informed us and evolved during our careers and our studies. It's incredibly important to avoid politics. Now, I teach politics, and I always say to undergraduate students that politics is like advertising. It goes on around you all the time, and you think that you're not affected by it, but it impacts on you all day, every day. So politics is something that we have to avoid when we're working in these spaces, but that doesn't mean that we don't know about it. So we need to be honest and say that we understand the politics that underpins the establishment of this work, and even opinions that contribute to it and have a place in it. But it is not our job to use our political views to inform how we work within those groups. I completely accept, sitting around that table in that WHO group, that there is a deeply colonising power of Western perspectives. We were colonised as a nation that I live in, but I think Western medical science has a lot to answer for in terms of the power dynamics in interprofessional knowledge. And I'm also really mindful that there are sensitive concepts as we work through this. And we deal with these all the time in the spaces that I work in, and they're particularly complex on the international stage. So smoking is incredibly sensitive. In the 1940s, smoking was being promoted it was being advertised as being healthy. We know it's not. And so we have to be really sensitive about how we deal with it. Demons are a common concept in all areas of healthcare wisdom across the world, except Western medical science, and we just have to deal with the concept sensitively. And the materials that are used in healthcare are sensitive. So heavy metals cause people to be deeply concerned, as do leeches for some people, but actually leeches are in favour again in Western medicine. So just to summarise and to finish, health and healthcare are complex. The people who need access to them and those of us who deliver those services are living in these really complex spaces that transcend cultures and language and heritage and borders. And we need to have a really generous spirit as we interact with our service providers and our funders and the agencies that we work with, and as we engage with one another internationally. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been a great privilege. I'm grateful for being here. Go well.